Hello, everyone. This is the 183rd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Mr. Jurryt van de Vooren as we discuss the Dutch national team during the 1934 and 1938 World Cups. Mr. van der Duren is a Dutch professional sports historian. He has written books and articles on Dutch sports history. Welcome back, Jurrit.
Yeah, thank you for being back.
Before we begin today's discussion, if you would like to let us know about next week about the exposition about Ajax's 125th anniversary.
Yeah, it will be in the city archives of Amsterdam. So if one of the viewers will be in Amsterdam or will come to the city maybe this year until the end of August, then you have to go to the city archives, which is in the center of Amsterdam, and you can go to an exposition, free entrance, about Ajax, the Amsterdam Football Club, which is exactly 125 years old. And Ajax and City Archives are working together by making an exhibition about Ajax and also about Amsterdam, which is 750 years old. So two stories are combined in one exhibition, and I am one of the researchers finding a lot of new information about Ajax, not about their history and championships, because we know in which year Ajax became champion, but more about Ajax as a part of the Amsterdam society. So feel free to come. As I told, it's in Amsterdam Stadsarchief, in English, is Amsterdam City Archives, and the entrance will be free.
Let's go back in time. Last year, we discussed the Dutch national team and their adventures in the 1920s Olympics. So this time, we'll look at the national team in this decade of the 1930s that included two World Cup participations. So, what was the state and the level of football in the Netherlands domestically and at international level as we enter this new decade of the 1930s?
Yeah, before I start to analyze, it's maybe nice to say today for me, it's the 19th of April, and exactly 100 years ago, one of the most important Dutch football players before the Second World War was playing his first match for the national team. And also in the 30s, he would be very important. His name is Gerard van Heel, but he was known as Puk van Heel, playing for Feyenoord, and he would play some about 64 caps until the Second World War, which was a record for the Dutch national team until Ruud Krol in the 70s beat him. And Puk van Heel, exactly 100 years today, he was playing his first match against Switzerland, losing the match, unfortunately. But that's a good introduction about the state of Dutch football in the beginning of the 30s. The national team never had played international matches on the World Cup because only in 1930 the first World Cup was played in Uruguay, and the Netherlands was not a part of it. They were thinking about joining the 1930 World Cup, but it was too expensive to go to the other side of the world by boat at that time. And it was in the Netherlands forbidden to earn money as a football players. So professional football was not a part of the system in the Netherlands. And all that means all the Dutch players, they were just people who are working in daily life. And then they had to ask their boss, please, do you want to pay me for not being here for 2 months? And of course, no, there is no boss who wants to pay their people not to be on the floor. And that's the reason why the Dutch didn't join the first World Cup. Belgium did, the Netherlands, they were not there. And there are matches they played, of course, on the Olympics in 1928. The Netherlands joined. We already discussed it was only one match against Uruguay, again, losing. And the matches they played it were mostly played against Belgium and also other European countries. And the Netherlands themselves, they thought they were one of the best teams of Europe, but they were not.
So last time in our 1920s Olympics conversation, we touched up on the status of football in Dutch society And as you mentioned, it was still not a professional sport, as well as the role of newspapers and radio in the coverage of the game. How were these aspects different in this new decade?
Although football was not professional in the Netherlands, it was massive, especially by going to the stadium to look at a match. But also in 1928, there was the introduction of radio broadcasting live from football match. It was in 1928, the Netherlands against Belgium, and the Dutch radio journalist Han Hollander was covering the match live on radio for the first time ever in Dutch history. And in the 30s, more and more football matches were broadcasted live on radio as long as all the tickets were sold for the match. Otherwise, the National Football Union, the KNVB, Football Association, they didn't allow to broadcast because they were afraid people would stay home if they would know they could listen to the match at home on radio, so they wouldn't buy a ticket. But I think it was exactly the other way because people were listening to football on the radio. They wanted to see the next match because a lot of people never had seen or heard football because they were living in a small village somewhere far away from the big cities where they had good train connections. For example, there is a small village called Ouddorp. It's not far away from Rotterdam, but it was very far away in the 30s. They had no football team in Ouddorp because they didn't know the sport existed. And then they were listening to the national radio when Han Hollander was covering the matches, and especially the young boys of Ouddorp, they really liked what they were listening to. So they decided to start their own club. So because of the radio, people started new clubs to play football themselves. And that's one of the reasons football became even more popular during the 30s to watch in a stadium or to listen at the radio. And also more people are joining football clubs to play themselves. One of the things which was very important, which is very Dutch, is in the old days in the 20th century, the Dutch society was divided when socialist people were looking at socialist television companies or shows or socialist radio, listening to socialist radio, reading socialist newspapers, send their children to socialist schools, just like the Catholics did and other parts of the society did. So there were also Catholic football clubs in the Netherlands, and they were not part of the National Football Union, but they had their own Catholic football union. And in between the First and the Second World War, they started to their own football clubs, and it was massive because in between the First and the Second World War, if you were looking every three football clubs they started in the Netherlands, one of them was Catholic. And that's also why football became very popular during the 30s in the south of the Netherlands, the Catholic area. And not only because the Catholic thought, well, it's good to enjoy football, but it was to protect their Catholic people, to come in touch with socialist or non-Catholic or whatever people from the Netherlands, to stay in their own society, in the Catholic society.
Like you mentioned earlier, the Dutch did not travel to Uruguay for the 1930 World Cup for the reasons you mentioned. But do you know if there were any public debates whether they should
Oh, yes,
participate?
yes. Not even by going to the World Cup of 1930, but by organizing even the World Cup of 1930. There were some debates in national football if it wasn't, maybe it was possible for the Netherlands to organize the first World Cup, but after a discussion, a debate, it was decided not to do so. Also because Dutch government was not interested in sports at all. So they were also not interested in organizing anything, something like that. And in 1928, already the Olympics have been in Amsterdam. So within 2 years, maybe it would have been too much to organize Olympics and World Cups, which, especially 100 years ago, it was a little bit maybe too big to organize for the Netherlands. Then there was a debate of sending the Dutch team to Uruguay in cooperation with Belgium. Also, a part of Belgium is Dutch speaking. It was easy to have a discussion about it because then it would be maybe a little bit cheaper to send the Dutch team if it was organized in cooperation with the Belgian Football Association. But at the end, it was decided not to do so. Like the most European countries, decided not to go to Uruguay. And so the Netherlands, they were staying at home. And if you are looking back in history now, If we look at the World Cup, it's one of the most important events in world, not only in sports, but in general, which is broadcasted worldwide and seen by billions of people, which was, of course, absolutely not in 1930. Nobody could have seen 100 years ago, could have been expected the World Cup to be so massive like it is now. It was just like a new tournament with players from all over the world going to play some matches in a country we never heard of. And it wasn't that important for Dutch society in 1930. Football itself, it was important to play or to watch, but on a national level. And on an international level, it wasn't that important.
For the first time, for the 1934 edition of the World Cup, the Dutch would take part in the qualifiers, along with their Belgian neighbors and the Republic of Ireland. What was the takeaway from this first qualifying adventure? And as you can tell, it's not like today where you have multitude of teams in a group. This is only like three teams in a group.
Yeah, just like what I told about the first World Cup, it was completely different than it is nowadays. And in 1934 in Italy, it's a little bit far away also in 1934, but it was, you could organize it to go by train, and to go by train to Uruguay was a little bit difficult. So that was not an issue for the Netherlands. And playing against Belgium, well, it was the most well-known country in the Netherlands because since 1905, the Netherlands and Belgium were playing every year two matches against each other. Anyhow, so there were already played two matches in the same year as the qualification because they already said we will do that. This was two, well, one or two extra matches between the Netherlands and Belgium. Ireland, or the Republic of Ireland, as it was called those days, it was also known, but it was not as known as Belgium. And everybody in the Netherlands, just like most supporters of the club, think they will become world champion very easily. It was just like the Netherlands, who were not expecting any problems to qualify for a World Cup. And there, of course, were some players who had an international level, like Beb Bakhuis. He was one of the best players of the Netherlands. He would also become the first player as a professional later in the 30s, which was not allowed during that days. There were some great players, but there was no much information in the Netherlands about the state of football in the home nations like Great Britain and Ireland, or in the middle of Europe, Austria, Hungary, where they were playing great teams. And some Dutch journalists, sports journalists, they knew there was a lot of quality of players in those countries, but most of the Dutch football, well, people who go to football stadium, they didn't know. They were expecting, okay, the Netherlands, they will go to the World Cup and then become world champion, and then we have a big party. And it was not a good expectation. They were wrong.
And as far as the qualifiers, actually, the Dutch qualified rather comfortably. They defeated the Republic of Ireland 5-2.
In the Netherlands, we have a word which is called scorebord journalistiek, which means it's journalism by just looking at the results of the match and not at the match itself. And indeed it was 5-2, but it was a very, very difficult match for the Dutch team. And one of the goals of the Irish goals was a very strange one because the Dutch keeper, Adrie van Malen, Feyenoord, just like Puck van Heel, he already had the ball in his hands, but at that time it was not forbidden to attack the keeper when
Right.
he was holding the ball in his hands. So the Irish player, I think his name was Moore, he was pushing Adrie van Malen in his own goal at the moment when Van Malen was holding the ball in his hands. And the goal was, the ref said, okay, it's a good goal. So, and the Dutch journalists, they really attacked Van Malen. He was doing wrong. He was not doing anything wrong. And at that moment, it looked like the Netherlands was not qualifying for the World Cup. But then there was a new phenomenon in Dutch football, which was called het Hollandse kwartiertje, the Dutch 15 minutes, if I translate it into English. And in only 15 minutes, in the at the end of the match, then the Netherlands, they beat Ireland and then they qualified. So indeed, it was 5-2, but it was a very hard match for the Netherlands to win, and then they qualified.
And they also defeated Belgium a few weeks later. And a month ahead of that, that actually played Belgium as well, like you said, their annual matches, and they defeated them 9-3.
That's a very strange and also famous match in Dutch history, 9-3. And one of the strange things is was Belgium was scoring the first goal. So nobody was expecting during the match the Netherlands would beat the Belgians, the big rivals, with 9 goals. And then a lot of things happened during that match. There was one player for the Netherlands making 5 goals in one match, which is still a record. A lot of strange things happened during that match, but it was not a match for the World Cup qualification, as you just said,
Right,
because
right.
the Netherlands and Belgium were playing every year to match against each other.
The head of the Dutch selection committee was Karel Lotze, whose image would be tarnished following World War II.
Karel Lotzi, he was living in the city of Dordrecht, which is not far away from the city of Rotterdam, close to Belgium. But he was member of HFC, the Haarlem Football Club, so close to Amsterdam. And he, in his young days, he was a player, but he was not a good player. But then, when he was only 20 years old, they found out he was a very good coach. And he was very good in meetings, so he became a member of the board. And later, he was becoming very important for the Football Association of the Netherlands. And in the 30s, he was one of the leaders of the Dutch football team. During the Second World War, then his career would start as the president of the KNVB, the Dutch Football Association. And in the 30s, he really was the most important man of Dutch football. One of the things he started with, it was an innovation in the Dutch football, was not just looking to players if they were in a good health, if their legs and if their body was okay, but also to look if they were feeling okay. And every match, before every match, Lotzi was writing letters to all the players of the Dutch team, and in which he said, "You are a member of the Dutch team, and please be aware it's an honor to represent your country. And there will be people listening to radio when you are playing, and they are too ill to go out of the home. And so, if they hear you are making a goal, then they will be very happy, so you can make their lives better. And then the Dutch Lion will fight to conquer the world." Letters like that. And also, when he was having a speech, which was called in the Dutch Donderpreek, which means it was a speech to impress all the players. "You are entering the field, you are representing the Netherlands, and please be aware of it. And you are proud to wear the shirt of the Netherlands." And some players, they were really impressed by speeches like that. And other players, they said later, when the career was over, "Please, man, shut up and go away and let me play my match." But his so-called Donder speeches, Donderpreken, they were very famous. And I think it helped a little for the football players for the first 5 minutes. And then the match took over about what was happening in their head and on the field. And Lotzi, during the Second World War, and there was a lot of debate about it, about what he was doing in cooperation with the Germans, the Nazis, or not. And there have been a lot of debate about his role during the war. And in my opinion, he was not working together with the Nazis, but he was not thinking about what he was doing, like a lot of people in the Netherlands during the Second World War, what the Germans would benefit if you would cooperate with them. And I think also he was not thinking about it, but he was not a Nazi. He was not betraying people. And that's one of the things after the war, only in the 70s and in the 80s. So when he was already died in 1959, then a lot of people, also Dutch sports journalists, accused Karel Lotzi of being a traitor of the Netherlands and cooperating with the Nazis. That's not right to have a conclusion like that. But okay, he was not a nice guy. But I think that's not something you can punish for someone because he's not nice. He was not collaborating with the Germans.
Let's look at the 1934 World Cup, the Netherlands' first ever participation, the World Cup in Italy. For their first match and only match, they would play against Switzerland. It seems like there had been a false sense of confidence after the qualification campaign that they would do well in this World Cup. And of course, they face a rude awakening during this World Cup.
Mhm. To start, there was a political debate about the 1934 World Cup. If we talk about politics and sports, the debate always starts in 1936 during the Summer Olympics in Berlin, which was used for propaganda by the Nazis. It was not an idea of Adolf Hitler himself to use sports for his propaganda because he had seen it by how Mussolini was using the World Cup of 1934, so the Italian fascist, for making propaganda of fascism and Italy in 1934. Mussolini started it on the World Cup of 1934. It was not a national debate in the Netherlands, like we have to boycott the fascist World Cup of 1934, but there was a debate in socialist and communist newspapers. How can we be a part of a World Cup which will be used as propaganda by the fascists? But it was not a discussion at the Football Association. And as you said, the expectations were a little bit too high. And nowadays, when we look back, we can laugh about it. But it was the first time the Dutch football team was playing on a World Cup. So no one could know what would happen if you would be in a country far away from the Netherlands with a national team for a couple of weeks. What can happen? People get bored, or they are getting a fight with each other. Maybe they get drunk, whatever. And they could have a lot of fun. Everything can happen. But it's, nowadays, we know you have to take care of your team when you are going to a big tournament. In 1934, the Dutch Football Association, they never thought about the possibility of something could go wrong. With one thing, for example, is the national keeper of 1934, as I already told, it was Adrie van Malen, but he had to leave because of the goal against Ireland when he was pushed over the line with the ball in his hands. And then Carolossi said, we need another keeper. And then he said, I want to ask Geus van der Meulen to come back, also from HFC, where Lotzi was coming from. But he already stopped as being a keeper. He was the national keeper on the 1928 Olympics. He was by far the most important keeper from the Netherlands in the 20s, but not in the 30s. And then Lotzi said, I want you to come back. And you are also allowed, if you come to Italy, to take your wife with you for being in Italy. The other players were not allowed to bring their family with them. That was a very bad move for Carolozzi. Now we can look back because the other players, they were a little bit pissed off. Who's that old man and why is he bringing his wife with him? And my wife is at home. I'm feeling lonely. So what makes Geus van der Meulen better? As a keeper who was already stopped as a player. And that's one of the first things what happened is the team was not happy in Italy. In 1934, the most Dutch players, they were not aware about the heat, about the summer, about the food. Everything was different in Italy. And if you are playing only one match, you go by train, you stay in Italy for 2 days, and then you come home. But on the World Cup, it was you would be there for a couple of weeks. So you have to eat olives or other food you have never eaten. And the stomach will get upset because of it. All those things in 1930, it really happened. I think a lot of teams on the World Cup, they would have some problems, but especially the Netherlands. And that's the reason the 1934 World Cup would end as a big disappointment.
They would lose to Switzerland on May 27th at Milan
Yes.
3-2. There was a controversy at near the end of the match when Kicksmith apparently took a shot that was a goal, but the referee, the Swedish Ivan Eklund, I think he blew his whistle as the goal was being scored and they didn't accept the goal. So there was some protest
Yeah,
about the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
decision.
And there can be bad luck, of course, also during a tournament. All those things can happen. And there was no experience at all in the Netherlands how to handle with all those problems being a part of a World Cup and also playing against teams with professionals. In the Netherlands, it was not allowed to play with professional players. On the World Cup, a lot of teams were playing and they had professionals. So I think the Netherlands, even if they had some luck in the first match against Switzerland and they would have beaten it in the second round, if they had with to play against a country like Hungary or something like that, or then they would have been beaten also. We never know. There was a song before the Netherlands went for their trip to Italy. It was on broadcasted on radio. We gaan naar Rome. We are going to Rome. We gaan naar Rome. We gaan naar Rome. And it was a song about the Dutch going to the main capital of Italy, where the final would have been played of the World Cup. The Netherlands would easily win and go home as a world champion. And everybody was singing before the match against Switzerland started. And after the match, nobody could remember they ever sung the match we go, we gaan naar Rome.
That was the end of the first adventure. Some of the more famous names, obviously, was Captain Puck Van Heel mentioned, Beb
Bakhuis, yeah.
Backhuis, yeah.
It's
So this,
difficult, yeah.
yeah, yeah, some of the more famous names, and many of these players would actually also appear in the 1938 World Cup. Apart from Van Heel, you have Andreessen, Kick Smith, Lien Vente, Frank Wells, Mock Weber, also the manager, Bob Glendening, the Englishman. As far as Wim van Driessen, he would actually pass away a decade later due to pneumonia in 1944, in the middle of the war.
Andriessen was one of the most important players of Ajax, and he was the player with the most caps for Ajax before the Second World War. And in 1944, he became ill, and then he died. And officially, he didn't die because of the war, but the treatment in hospitals was not as
Yeah.
good anymore as it was in normal days. So Andriessen could have been survived it, but he didn't because of the war. And then he died in 1944. It was just a couple of weeks after he wrote his book of his life, and then he died. And then his son, Andriessen Junior, in 19 on the day of liberation in the Netherlands, or on the 7th of May, just a couple of days after the liberation, he was shot on the Dam Square in Amsterdam, when there was a big fight against the Germans during parties to celebrate. At the end of the war, a lot of people were killed that day. And Andries, as a young boy, I think he was only 12 years old, he had a bullet in his back and he had to go to hospital. He nearly survived. And then in the beginning of the 50s, he also became a player of Ajax, the main squad. And most of Ajax people, they didn't know until I wrote about him. He nearly survived the disaster of the Dam in 1945. Maybe a couple of inches, he was away from death.
This first World Cup participation, did it in any way have an impact on the game back home in terms of interest or otherwise?
No, no, not at all. Life just went on, and after the summer of 1934, the new competitions in the Netherlands that started, and I think the players of the national team, they had a lot of more experience, but at a general level, no, because there was no professional football in the Netherlands, so there were no managers to find out how they can use all those experiences, collecting data about making football better. The Dutch players, they went to Italy, they came back from Italy, they had a short holiday, and then they had to go to business, and it was not business on football, but it was as an employee for a factory, or maybe they had their own shop to sell cigarettes or sports things. And there was no big change of Dutch football. It would only be in the 60s that Dutch football would become better because of international football.
As the 1938 World Cup is getting closer, geopolitical events are at the forefront in Europe. How did this affect the Dutch public psyche and its effect on football domestically?
Well, as a whole, there was a debate about the first World Cup for the Netherlands in Italy, fascist Italy, and it was not a national debate. Well, after, then it was 1936, there was the Olympics, winter and summer, both in Nazi Germany, Garmisch-Partenkirchen, and Berlin. And then the debate was becoming a little bit bigger. And also the German national team in 1935, it was playing a match in Amsterdam in the Olympic Stadium against the Netherlands. And it was at that time when Hitler already was in power. So the Germans, they making their Nazi salute, raising their right arm. There were some demonstrations, especially outside the Olympic Stadium, but it was only by the very left Revolutionary Socialist Party, and it was not a national demonstration. 1936, it became a bigger issue because then it became more and more, we found out what was going on in Germany and the Nazis. And in 1938, when the World Cup was held in France, which was a political enemy of the Germans. Then the debate was going on and on and on. And in 1938, there was also political, very strange thing happening. Austria became a part of Germany in 1938, Anschluss in German. And Austria, they had a very good national football team. It already qualified to go to the World Cup of 1938. But in between qualification and the World Cup, Austria became a part of became a part of Germany. So the Austrian national team didn't exist anymore. It's the only time in history of the World Cup a team who has qualified, a country which has qualified, didn't game to the tournament because it didn't exist anymore. And the best players of Austria, they were also a part of the German team. And Hitler was thinking, well, I have now the best German players and the best Austrian players, so we will become world champion. Or then, just like the Netherlands after the first match against Switzerland, again, just like in 1934, Netherlands, they were beaten, the Germans, so they had to go home. It has a lot of politics. The French, they were laughing about the Germans when they were losing their match. They were the big laugh because of their Nazi propaganda. It didn't work in France in 1938. And that's the reason why the 1934 World Cup, 1936 Summer and Winter Games, 1938 World Cup in France, they were very, very political.
For this 1938 World Cup qualifiers, the Dutch are once again with Belgium and this time Luxembourg as the other team. And again, this process was a formality like in 1934. They tied with Belgium and they comfortably defeated Luxembourg, and both the Netherlands and Belgium were through to the World Cup. As they entered this 1938 World Cup in France, in retrospect, do you think the team was better prepared on and off the field than in 1934? And also, it contained some of the remnants of this 1934 squad that we mentioned earlier.
I hardly think so. Maybe the players, they knew a little bit better what to expect, but it's not about the players, it's about the organization of the national team. And I don't think the organization from 1938 and 1938 it was better than in 1934 because the Football Association, it was as bad prepared, I guess, as in 1934. By the way, there was a second Dutch team playing in 1938 on the World Cup. It was Netherlands-India,
Oh,
Dutch
yes. Yeah.
East Indies, and they were the first Asian team ever to qualify for World Cup. Not because they qualified by beating other teams, but a lot of other teams said we are not coming. And then finally there were a lot of teams not playing. Then France said, please, Netherlands, India, can you come and play? I said, it's okay. So they took the boat and they went to France, which was extremely big travel in 1938. And that's the reason why two teams were playing in 1938 on the World Cup by using the Dutch hymn. It's Wilhelmus. And they both lost their first match and then they went both home to the Netherlands, and then they were playing in Olympic Stadium in Amsterdam, another match against each other. It's the only time Netherlands, the Dutch team, was playing against, which is now Indonesia, in before the Second World War.
Yes, so the Dutch, for their only match, they faced Czechoslovakia, the 1934 World Cup finalists, who also contained some of their players from that World Cup, most particularly the goalkeeper František Planikča and Oldrich Nejedly, among others. This match, it would be scoreless for 90 minutes and it would go into extra time. And we have to mention that the Netherlands, Freek van der Veen, he sprained his ankle and he had to leave the field at the time of the extra time. So Czechoslovakia had a one-man advantage basically for this extra time. And they would win 3-0 and the Dutch were out. Incidentally, the Dutch goalkeeper was the much criticized Adrie van Maal.
He was back in town. Yeah.
Right. This is two World Cups, two early eliminations. But maybe in this case, we can say perhaps they were a little unlucky because of the injury.
Yeah. Just like they maybe had some bad luck on 1934, but that's a part of the game. You can have bad luck, or you can be lucky by a decision, or just by an accident, you win the match. That's a part of football. At least in 1938, there was no song We gaan naar Parijs. We are going to Paris, like it was 4 years before We gaan naar Rome. And maybe the Dutch people, they realized a little bit better. It wasn't that easy to win a World Cup as they were thinking 4 years before. That's a difference. And those two World Cups in the 30s, they were the last until 1974, when the Netherlands was reaching the final with Totaal Voetbal, Johan Cruyff. And in 1974, no one could remember how to organize a team going to the World Cup because it was in the 30s, the last time it happened. I think that's one of the reasons the influence of the World Cups of the 30s, they are not very big in Dutch football. Also because only 2 years after the 1938 World Cup, everything changed because of the Second World War. And that's a big shift in history, and especially in Dutch history.
We should mention that for this 1938 World Cup, the Dutch had the distinction of having the youngest and the oldest players at this World Cup. Bertus de Harder was 18 years old and Wim Andreessen was 34 years old. On balance, what do you think are the main differences between the 1934 and the 1938 adventures?
I don't think there are very big differences. It's although it's an area where there was a lot of debate about the political influence on international sports, it was not a really big issue in the Netherlands. It started to change during the 30s because we were looking what was going on in Nazi Germany. But Dutch sports, they were a little bit jealous about the position of sports in Germany. And we have to be aware at that time, people didn't know the Second World War would become a result of it, about what happened in Germany. They didn't know. And in Germany and also in Italy, sport was very important for the national Nazis and the fascists. So there was a lot of money, a lot of attention, a lot of good stadiums. And in the Netherlands, Dutch sports, they didn't have any attention of national government. So there was a reason to be jealous. Of course, now we know there was also a reason to fund sports in fascist and Nazi countries for making propaganda. There was a little change in attitude in the political debate in the Netherlands in the 30s, but on a general level, on how the Dutch team was playing their international matches, still the yearly match against Belgium was the most important match of the year. The Derby van de Lage Landen, the Derby of the Low Countries. That was the traditional match. And a World Cup, well, it's nice to go to play a World Cup, but it wasn't a big issue like it is now. And I think something maybe have changed for players like Backhuis and Kick Smith, you already mentioned, how to play on an international level on a World Cup. But for football, Dutch football in general, I don't think it didn't change very much.
As we get closer to the end of the decade, had the radio coverage changed from the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade? Had there been an evolution?
The first matches, they were covered by Han Hollander. And as I already told you, and now it's becoming very difficult if you're not coming from the Netherlands, the society was divided in parts like the Catholics and the Protestants and the Socialists and the Liberals. They all had their own world. And Han Hollander, he was of the liberal part of the Netherlands. And the broadcasting company called Avro, they were allowed to make radio on Sunday, which was very important because on Sunday football matches were played in the Netherlands. So they were played on the day when the Afro was broadcasting. But during the 30s, also other days would be on Wednesday, maybe in the evening or on Saturday. And then the Afro was not broadcasting. Then it was the VARA, Socialist, or KRO, Catholic. And that was the reason not only Han Hollander was broadcasting the matches of the national team. Also, someone like Ad van Emmenes, he was doing it for VARA Radio, the socialist part. More radio journalists were coming, but they were not as popular as Han Hollander. During the 30s, when more and more matches and sports events were broadcasted live by Dutch radio, more and more experience how to organize also the technical aspects, technical things of how to connect from stadium to studio to broadcast live. All things were new, all things they had to find out on the day itself, how we can organize something like that. How is it possible someone is sitting on the roof of the Olympic Stadium and people can hear it on radio right here, right now? A lot of things to organize. And now we can use a telephone and use internet to be a real-time reporter. But in the 30s, everything was new. And there was a lot of development, of course, and innovation during the 30s, which was used also for sports because also in the 30s, football was very popular for people to listen. And now we can find out by how many people were watching a football match on television. In the 30s, it was also possible to find out how many people were listening to football on national radio. And then they found out it was something like 70 or 80% of all the people who were listening to radio, they were listening to football, 70, 80%, which was massive. That's why Avro really wanted to have the Sunday as the most important day for them to broadcast. Then the most people were listening, earning money, getting more members, people paying money to Avro to become a member. And you can see it's the beginning also of sports, football, media, and all commercial aspects. And that started in the 30s for the Netherlands and football.
Comparing to the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade, had there been an improvement in terms of the playing infrastructure, etc.?
Yes, but it has more. The reason why the infrastructure has been better, there were a lot of new stadiums built. Ajax, De Meer in the east of Amsterdam, 1934. The Kuip, Rotterdam, Feyenoord, it was in 1937. The city of Utrecht, Nijmegen, they all had new stadiums in the 30s. But it was not because they wanted to develop sports as an important part of society. It's completely the other way. It was the economic depression. In 1929 it started. In the Netherlands, the 30s, it was a very rough time. A lot of unemployment. People had no reason to find out how they can earn money. And then Dutch government started a lot of projects in the country to build buildings, and people were not asked if they want to build, they were forced to. If they say you are unemployed, if you are not coming to build the stadium or to do the work, then you will get no money, no funding anymore. So they were forced. And under those circumstances, which were awful, all the new stadiums were built. For sports, it was great because the infrastructure, a lot of stadiums we still know, Galgenwaard, the Kuip, De Meer already, now it's Johan Cruyff Arena, they were built in the area of the economic depression to hope to find for people to have some work and to get some money. But it was a kind of, well, how do you say, it was, you were forced to do the work if you were unemployed. But at the end, the Dutch sports, they had a lot of new stadiums and a lot of new facilities. It has nothing to do with how football was developing during the 30s. It was all connected with the economic depression.
In each of these World Cups, the Netherlands were managed by the English manager Robert Glendening, who also managed them in the 1928 Olympics. What is his impact in Dutch football history?
He was very important because he was the coach of the Dutch team, but he was not the manager of the Dutch team. Karel Lotzi, he was the most important man of Dutch football. He decided which players were asked to join the national team, and then Glendenning was the one to find a way to how to play with those people.
So he's mostly a physical trainer.
Yes, yes, yes. So he was not responsible of all the other things about the organization, which players were allowed to be a part of the national team. There were three people from the KNVB, the Football Association, who were responsible, and the most important was Karel Lotzi. And then when they finished their job by say to the football players, you now are a part of the Dutch team, then Glendening, at that moment, his job started. Yes, very important because he was coming from England, and in the Netherlands, they thought, well, he's from England, they invented football, so it's better to ask people who come who lived in the country, who were born in the country where they invented football. So football is part of his DNA. They didn't know the word, of course, DNA in the 30s, but to ask him, because he was coming from a country of football, and please make our football also better. But they were not making him responsible of the organization itself.
So if we compare the 1920s Olympics and the 1930s World Cups, in which era was there objectively more progress at every level?
I think it's a little bit comparable to each other. 1925 until 1940. In 1920, the Netherlands, they joined the Olympics in Belgium. In 1925, for they joined the Olympics in Paris. In 1928 in Amsterdam. And that were the first experiences of being a part of the most important football tournament of those days. And then the 34 and 38 World Cups, they were also the most important football tournaments of those days. So I don't think it's good to split the 20s and the 30s to compare. I think it's better to see Dutch football as a whole if you want to understand what happened between the First World War and the Second World War. So it started in 1920 and it ended in 1938 in France. It's a whole area. It's nearly impossible to split.
Have there been any debates whether the trajectory of Dutch football would have been different without the war?
Yeah, there is always the debate about what would have happened if there was not a war, but everybody realizes it's not the most important question you can ask about the Second World War. What would have happened with Dutch football if there was no war? It was disastrous for Dutch society in general, and the Holocaust in the Netherlands, it was massive. 100,000 people killed of 120,000 Jews there were in the Netherlands before the war started. Those issues, they are important if we are looking at the Second World War, not about the state of football. And of course, things would have been different if there was no war. A lot of players, they would have been able to play more matches, of course, on an international level, like Abel Lenstra, one of the most Dutch football players in history from the north of the Netherlands, Heerenveen. He played his first match in the national team in 1940, just a couple of weeks before the Netherlands were invaded by the Germans. And of course, his football career would have been different without a war. But that's not the issue. The issue is about the disastrous results of the war on Dutch society for the Dutch Jews. That's important, not football.
In closing, what is the cultural legacy of these World Cup performances in Dutch football history? Do you think these, in a way, helped the growth of the game into the post war era that led to professionalism in 1954?
Well, maybe I think more important in the 30s than the World Cup is broadcasting the matches of the Dutch team and Dutch football teams on radio, because a lot of new people, they find out about football and how they liked it, and they wanted to buy a ticket for a next match or to start their own football club. And that's more important for Dutch football, that people wanted to go to football matches or to become a member, than the World Cup itself. Because more people were coming to football matches, more money was earned by the stadiums, by the football clubs, and by the football association, but nothing was paid to the football players. In the days of the economic depression, where a lot of Dutch football players, they had no job in daily life. So what happened is they were playing every week in stadiums with 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people, all paying money for the ticket to see them, and they had no income. And all the money was going to the football association and to the football clubs and the stadiums where they were playing. And the debate of starting professional football started, it may sound a little bit strange, but it started in socialist newspapers, because they said it's not fair to earn money with football and not paying the players who are earning the money. And they were not asking to give the players millions of guldens in those days like it is now. No, just to give them money so they can earn their money and to buy food and to give their children and their wife, their family, a reason to live. and where most football players, they had no opportunity to earn money in the 30s. And that's the start of the debate of professional football. We have to be aware about how the players are earning the money and not getting any penny for what they're doing, all their labor, their work. And to give one example, again, Adrie van Malen from Feyenoord. When they were asked, all those players, to play matches for the national football team, the only money they received was for their traveling costs. And there was a match played in Sparta Stadium, Rotterdam, where Adrie van Malen lived. So he received exactly 25 cents for his traveling costs. And the stadium and Sparta and the KNVB were earning 5,000 guilders that day when the Dutch team was playing in the stadium. 25 cents was given to Adrie van Malen, who was playing as a keeper for the national team. And that's the reason why socialist newspapers started a debate. That's not the way we have to organize it. So we have to pay those players working as a player for the national team. But it only in 1954, so after the World War, 10 years after the Second World War, then it would be the start of professional football. Only then.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Van der Duren's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Jurryt, thank you once again and hope to continue these
Yeah, thank you for being
discussions
here.
on
Yeah, thank
football
you.
history. Thank you.